I want to show you what these verses in Ephesians chapter 5 are all about. The Apostle Paul has been addressing families. He addresses wives here, then he addresses husbands, then he addresses parents, fathers, and children. But this section today, Paul addresses husbands. And his words to husbands are fundamental for having a successful marriage. Here's the big idea. The big idea is this: the way that Jesus treats the church teaches husbands how they are to treat their wives. And that raises a really significant question. If the way Jesus treats the church teaches husbands how to treat their wives, how did Jesus treat the church? And there's two things primarily that we see. First, in these verses, we see how did Jesus treat the church? Well, he loved the church by sacrificing for the church, giving himself up for the church. That's the first way that Jesus treats the church. The second way that Jesus treats the church comes here in these verses. Jesus nourishes and cherishes the church. That's the second example Christ sets for husbands. And so the big idea is that the way Jesus treats the church teaches husbands how to treat their wives. And if husbands will treat their wives this way, this is the path to having a good marriage. Let's think about this first way first. Jesus loves the church by sacrificing for the church. By the way, before I get further, the main idea is that husbands are to love their wives. And this word love comes up several times. Verse 25, then verse 28, husbands should love their wives, he who loves his wife. And then here in verse 33, loving his wife. So if you take one thing away, husbands should love their wives. But how do they do that? The same way that Christ loved the church. Christ loved the church by sacrificing for the church. He loved the church and gave himself up for her. Husbands, this is the essence of being a husband, of loving your wife, sacrificing for your wife. I think it's possible to kind of complain about this and say, man, all I ever do is sacrifice for my wife. All I ever do is put her needs in front of my own. Well, that's what it is to be a husband. It's to sacrifice. It's to put her needs and desires and wants in front of your own. So never complain about that responsibility, because that's what Jesus did for the church. Jesus loved the church and gave himself up for her. And that teaches you as a husband how to treat your wife. That's what leadership in the home looks like. It looks like sacrificing for your wife. Now, Paul gives us 3 reasons for why Jesus sacrificed for the church. You see it in these words: that he might, that she might be. So really there's like 3 reasons for why Jesus sacrificed for the church. The image here really is kind of like a bride on her wedding day. The church is also called the bride of Christ. And so a bride on her wedding day, what does she do? She takes a bath, she gets all clean, then she puts on her best clothes, and she's in all her splendor without any kind of a blemish. And that's the bride on her wedding day. And I think that's the image here. Jesus died for the church, sacrificed for the church, so that the church would be presented to himself, all forgiven, all cleaned up. That's the idea. So Jesus gave himself up for the church that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. And so Christians are saved and forgiven, and they're all washed up. And then they're presented to Christ, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, holy and without blemish. And so Jesus dies on the cross, and Christians are all cleaned up from their sin, and then they're presented to Christ. It's this beautiful picture. So Jesus loves the church by sacrificing for the church. That's the first lesson. Husbands, that's how you treat your wives. That's how you lead your wives, through sacrifice. The second way that Christ treats the church is this: he nourishes and cherishes the church. That's how husbands should treat their wives. Let's read these next verses. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. So, lesson number 2. Jesus nourishes the church and cherishes the church. Husbands, you do the same. What does it mean to nourish? That means to provide for, like providing for physical needs like food and clothing. So on a basic level, husbands, this is on you. Nourish your wife, nourish your family. But also this word is important, cherishing. Jesus doesn't just provide for the physical needs of the church, he cherishes the church. That word cherish is used also in the New Testament as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. It talks about love and comfort. Imagine a mother who only provides food for her little baby. And when the baby cries, refuses to hug and snuggle and love the baby. Well, that's neglect. But Christ doesn't treat the church that way. Christ nourishes the church and cherishes the church, comforts the church, loves the church. And that's how husbands should treat their wives. So husbands, it's not enough to say, listen, I provided all the food that our family needs and a beautiful home for our family. What else do I need to do? You need to cherish your wife. You need to provide for her emotional needs. You need to comfort and love your wife. So maybe that looks like putting your phone down, turning the TV off, looking at your wife and saying, honey, how are you doing? How can I be praying for you? Nourish and cherish your wife. And a husband who thinks, well, what's in it for me if I do this? Well, the amazing thing is that when you will nourish and cherish your wife, you actually benefit yourself. He who loves his wife loves himself. When you invest in your wife, your whole marriage is benefiting from that. Why? Because we're the same body. The husband and wife, two have become one. Now, the first half of this text to husbands has been saying this. The way that Jesus treats the church teaches husbands how to treat their wives. The last verses here in this section say something amazing. This section says this. Marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. So the way the Christ treats the church teaches husbands how to treat their wives, and the way husbands and wives interact, that is meant to be a picture, a portrayal of Christ and the church to a watching world. Watch how this unfolds. Paul quotes from Genesis when he says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound. This whole idea of marriage is a profound thing. But I'm saying that this mystery, that is husband and wife becoming one flesh, that refers to Christ and the church. So all along, God's design for marriage is that ultimately marriage would portray to a watching world how Christ and the church interact. So husbands and wives, it matters how you treat each other. Because your marriage is a portrayal to a watching world of Christ and his love for the church. So the way the husband loves the church portrays how Christ loves the church, and the way that a wife submits to her husband portrays to a world how the church ought to submit to Christ. Then Paul ends this section with this summary statement. However, let each of one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Here's the thing. This is a picture of a healthy marriage. When wives and husbands treat each other this way, you get a healthy marriage. And that's a beautiful thing. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.